He already knew it was a trap. He went anyway. Not because he was brave, not because he was reckless, not because he didn't have a choice. He went because he built the trap. And the men inside it had no idea. Picture this. 11 p.m. an abandoned shipyard at the dead edge of the city. Rain coming down so hard it sounds like static. 10 professional killers in the dark, snipers, shooters, a command post elevated 40 feet above the kill zone, all of them waiting, loaded, ready. And walking through the front gate, alone, is a man in a black coat. No bodyguards, no weapons anyone can see, no hurry. He walks to the center of the yard, stops under the one working flood lamp, rain hammering his coat, light cutting down through the dark like a spotlight. He looks up at the shadows where the killers are hiding. And he says, "I know you're there." He's not shouting, he's not panicking. He sounds like a man who is exactly where he intended to be. Because he is. This is the story of Dominic Cross, the man they tried to kill, the man who let them try, and the night an ambush became something else entirely, something far more dangerous than anyone in that shipyard understood. Stay with me. You need to hear how this ends. Introduction: the most dangerous man in the city. You've never heard his name. That's exactly how he wants it. Dominic Cross doesn't exist in any newspaper. No profile picture, no press conference, no charity gala, no quote on record anywhere. In the city's official history, he is invisible. In the city's real history, the history that runs underneath the streets, through the back doors of courthouses and the private rooms of police precincts, and the hushed phone calls between men who make real decisions, Dominic Cross is the only name that makes other powerful men speak quietly when they say it. He is 43 years old. He built his operation from nothing, a room above a fish market, borrowed money, and a mind that worked differently than any mind in the city. While other men in his world ruled through fear, through loudness, through violence, through making sure everyone knew how dangerous they were, Dominic ruled through something else entirely. He ruled through knowing. He always knew more than you, more than his enemies, more than his allies, more than the federal agents who had built 2 separate cases against him, both of which collapsed before they reached a courtroom, for reasons that were never officially explained. He had survived 3 attempts on his life. He had outlasted 5 rivals who, at various points, had believed they were in a position to replace him. He had fought 1 war, against the Case Lottie family, a war that cost 17 lives, and ended it in 72 hours by walking into the Case Lottie leader's home without an appointment and sitting down at his kitchen table. He had not raised his voice once in that meeting. He had not needed to. Because the Case Lottie leader looked at Dominic Cross across that table and understood something that took most men much longer to understand. This man is never reacting. He is always 10 moves ahead, and if he is sitting at your table, he is not here because you cornered him. He is here because he chose to be. That is the thing about Dominic Cross that nobody, not rivals, not enemies, not the men who worked for him and loved him like a father, ever fully grasped. He never went anywhere he didn't choose, including on a rain-soaked Thursday night, Gate 7 of the Old South Shipyard, where 10 men were waiting to kill him, where they had been waiting for hours, where they had made every preparation a professional kill crew could make, and where, even now, Dominic Cross was walking toward them, not in spite of the danger. Because of it, he knew something they didn't. He always did. The man who blinked. The meeting was Falcon's idea. That was the first sign. In 16 years, Enzo Falcone had never once requested a meeting with Dominic Cross. He answered meetings. He attended them. He received them the way a subordinate receives an order, gratefully, promptly, without complaint. That was Falcone's nature. A man who had gotten very comfortable in his lane and stayed there. Loyal, reliable and unambitious, or so Dominic had always believed. But 3 days before the shipyard, Falcone called and asked for a sit-down. That alone told Dominic everything. Not the details, not yet, but the shape of it. The fact that Falcone was initiating something meant someone else had told him to. Falcone didn't initiate, he executed. They met at the private room off Via Corso. White tablecloths, candlelight, the smell of good wine. Falcone arrived first and was already eating when Dominic walked in, another sign. A nervous man eats. It gives his hands something to do. "There's a shipment," Falcone said, without looking up from his plate. "Carrillo Brothers, Thursday night, South Docks, Container 47. They need clearance from you personally." Dominic sat, did not touch the food in front of him. "What's in the container?" "Unmarked currency, Lisbon route." Dominic said nothing, he watched. Falcone talked. He always talked when he was nervous, words filling silence the way water fills a crack, natural and unstoppable. He talked about the logistics, the timing, the Carrillo brothers' reputation for clean runs. His rings caught the light. His voice was steady. But his eyes weren't. Every 8 to 10 seconds they moved. Door, window, table, door again. It was barely visible, a flicker, a fraction of a second. Most men would never catch it. Dominic caught it every time. Falcone's eyes told the real story. He was watching the exits, not because he was afraid of Dominic, because he was afraid of what would happen if Dominic said no. He's been told the outcome needs to be yes, Dominic thought, and he's terrified of the person who told him that. "Thursday at what time?" Dominic said. 11 Gate 7. Gate 7, the deepest, most isolated point in the old South Docks. A location with no cameras, no active personnel, no line of sight from the working port. A location you choose if you wanted to conduct business with no witnesses. Or if you wanted to murder someone with no witnesses. "I'll be there," Dominic said. Falcone looked up for the first time since the conversation started. Something crossed his face, relief, and underneath the relief, something darker, something that looked like guilt. He blinked it away fast. Not fast enough. Dominic picked up his water glass, sipped, set it down. He thought 20 years and 20 years and this is what you are now. He said nothing. He smiled pleasantly. He left. In the car 4 blocks from the restaurant, Dominic said, "Pull Falcone's financials, last 60 days, quietly." T.O., his driver, did not respond. He never responded to these instructions. He simply processed them and made them happen. And Petra tonight. Petra Sorin operated from the back room of a laundry on the east side. A woman who existed in the gap between the official world and the real one, who had built a career on knowing things that couldn't be known through legitimate channels. She had worked for 3 different organizations across her career. She worked for Dominic now, exclusively, though she would deny it if asked, because Dominic paid better and because of the debt. The debt was not money. It was something larger, older, and heavier, something she would never be able to fully repay, which meant she would never stop trying. She was waiting when he arrived. That was unusual. Petra didn't wait for people. She handed him a folded page before he'd crossed the room. He opened it standing up, read it in 12 seconds, folded it and put it in his pocket. The page showed 3 wire transfers. The origin account was registered in Cyprus. Dominic recognized the account structure immediately, a specific shell configuration he had seen before, 3 years ago, attached to a man who had since vanished from this city under circumstances that everyone understood but no one discussed. Silvio Mancetti. The transfers included one to Falcone, €70,000, 22 days ago. Dominic filed this in the place in his mind where he filed things that confirmed what he already suspected. The drawer was not empty. He'd had Mancetti in it for 18 months. "The Voss crew," he said. Petra's posture changed. Barely. The kind of change only Dominic would notice. A slight tightening around the jaw, a micro-adjustment in the set of her shoulders. The change of a person who has just heard a name they were not expecting. "They're in the Port District," she said. 8 to 10 men, professionals not local. They scout 24 hours early, then go completely dark before the operation. "What's their command configuration?" She looked at him. Elevated position, single commander, radio signal to trigger. Dominic nodded slowly. One more question. The one that would tell him whether he had enough. "Did they scout yet?" "Last night," Petra said. "South Docks, Gate 7. Silence. Dominic looked at the bare bulb above them. Let everything settle into its correct shape. "Falcon, the Carillo fiction, Gate 7. Thursday at 11. The Voss crew, Mansetti's money." The picture was complete. He had one decision to make. He made it in less than 5 seconds. "Thank you, Petra." He walked out into the rain, and he thought not about the ambush, not about the danger, about something much more interesting. Mansetti had made a move. After 3 years of silence, Mansetti had finally moved. And he had done it in a way that was elegant, subtle, using Falcon as a bridge, using the Voss crew's professional reputation as a guarantee, setting up the location, the time, the conditions, thinking through every variable except one. He had planned to catch Dominic Cross by surprise. And Dominic Cross had not been surprised by anyone in 11 years. He stood in the rain, hands in his pockets, face turned slightly up to the dark sky. He almost felt something like gratitude. After 3 years of waiting, Mansetti had finally given him exactly what he needed. The question was what to do with it. He knew the who, he knew the where, he knew the when. What Mansetti didn't know was that Dominic had been waiting for this exact moment for 22 months. And that the real plan hadn't started 3 days ago. It had started before Mansetti even began to scheme. The architecture of a counter-trap. Dominic spent the night alone. Not sleeping, thinking, in the way he always thought, not rushing toward a solution, but letting the full shape of the situation become visible the way a photograph develops, slowly in the dark, until every detail is sharp. By 4 a.m. the shape was clear. Not what to do. He'd known that since the laundry. But how specifically, surgically, without a single wasted move, how to turn what Mansetti had built against him completely. There was an ordinary way to handle this. Call in his best men, fortify against the Voss crew, intercept the operation before Thursday, expose Falcon, isolate Mansetti. Clean, safe, effective. Dominic rejected it before breakfast. The ordinary way accomplished the immediate problem and nothing more. Mansetti would disappear again. The Eastern families who had been quietly watching, who had been circling Dominic's operation for 2 years looking for a crack, they would note the disruption, recalibrate, and wait for the next opening. No. What Dominic needed was not a solution. What he needed was a demonstration, something that would travel, something that would be told in hushed voices at the right tables by the right people for years. He needed to walk into the ambush. He needed to let the Voss crew fire. And he needed to walk out unchanged. Not survived, not escaped. Walked out unchanged. There is a difference, and the men in this world who mattered understood it. He called Marco Vega at 7 a.m. Not to the office, to a private location, a specific apartment that existed for conversations Dominic never wanted on any record. He told Marco everything. Took 40 minutes. Marco did not interrupt once. When Dominic finished, Marco was quiet for a long time. "Then you want to walk in there?" "Yes." "Knowing they're loaded and in position?" "Yes." Marco's jaw was very tight. 20 years together, And there were still moments when Dominic Cross made him feel like a man standing at the edge of something with no visible bottom. "The plan only works if I know," Dominic said. "And only if no one else does, not the other lieutenants, not your driver, no one." Marco looked at him. "What about Falcon?" "Falcon plays his role. He thinks Thursday night proceeds normally. He thinks I'm walking into a clean kill." A pause. "He needs to believe that completely. If he senses anything is wrong, it changes." Marco absorbed this. "What do you need from me?" 4 men. The best 4. Men I've known personally for more than 5 years. No recent financial irregularities. No outside contact in the last 3 months. And a specific piece of infrastructure. The service tunnel under the western fence of the south yard. Marco looked up. "That tunnel hasn't been used in 8 years, I know, which means the Voss crew doesn't know about it. They had 24 hours to scout. They missed it." Dominic's eyes were steady and absolutely calm. "That's the entry point for your men, 2 hours before the operation starts." Marco was quiet again, calculating, running the angles the way a good soldier runs them, looking for the weak points, the variables, the things that could go wrong. "The command position," he said. "The Voss commander, you said elevated. Crane control room, left side of the yard. Access is internal, the maintenance shaft inside the crane housing." Dominic looked at him. "You'll go up that way, alone, when the lights go out." "When the lights," Marco stopped. "Who's cutting the power?" Dominic said a name. One name. A person Marco had heard of but never met. A specialist who existed on the far edge of Dominic's network. Used exactly twice before for operations that required someone who left no trace and asked no questions. "He'll be in position on top of Warehouse C by 6 p.m., Dominic said. "He cuts the flood lamp for 30 seconds on my signal. That's the window. Your men move into position. I move. You go up the shaft." Marco let the full picture sit in his mind for a moment. Then, and in those 30 seconds in the dark, the Voss crew panics. "Yes." Because they're in position for a clean kill, and suddenly the target and the lights both disappear. "Yes." And they're going to fire anyway, into nothing. Probably. Which makes them the aggressor. Dominic said nothing, which was yes. Marco understood. In this world, in the specific legal and reputational gray zone they operated in, who fired first mattered. An attack that is responded to is a different story than an attack that is initiated. One is war. The other is self-defense. The difference shaped how people talked about it, how it traveled, what lesson it taught. "One more thing," Dominic said. "Haas." Marco's eyes sharpened. Haas was the name of a mid-level man inside the Voss crew, a man with debts that Dominic had been quietly financing for over a year. Not recruited, not activated, simply maintained like a key kept in a drawer that you hope you'll never need. Dominic had needed him. "Haas confirmed the layout 2 days ago," Dominic said. "Eastern catwalk, 2 ground-level points. Command in the crane room, trigger signal is 3 radio clicks." He stood. "We know every position. We know the timing. We know the signal." He straightened his coat. "There are no unknowns." Marco looked at him for a long moment. "No unknowns," he repeated, not as confirmation, as something closer to awe. "Get me the 4 men," Dominic said, "and Marco." He paused at the door. "Falcon, don't tip it. Nothing in your behavior changes. You see him, you treat him normally. He needs to walk into Thursday night thinking everything is exactly as planned." Marco held his gaze. "And after Thursday?" Dominic opened the door. "After Thursday," he said, "Falcon is no longer your problem." He walked out. The architecture was complete, every piece in place, every move mapped. But there was still one name Dominic hadn't told Marco about. One name he'd been carrying alone for 22 months. The name that started all of this. And the reason the plan went far deeper than anyone could see. The ghost and the debt. Before Thursday, before the Voss crew, before Falcon took a phone call from a Cyprus number and agreed to betray the man who had trusted him for 20 years. Before all of it, there was Silvio Mancetti. And there was what Dominic had done to him. 3 years ago, Mancetti was a power in this city. Not Dominic's equal, no one was, but a significant force. He controlled 4 distribution routes, 2 storage facilities in the Port District, and a network of officials that gave him reach into 2 government departments. He was wealthy, connected, and careful. And then he made his move on Dominic's eastern docks. It was precise, well-funded, well-executed. He bribed 9 port supervisors across a 6-week window, building the route slowly, with patience. He rerouted 3 of Dominic's shipments without anyone noticing. He began placing his own people in positions adjacent to Dominic's operation. He was 6 weeks into it when Dominic disassembled everything in 72 hours. Not because he just noticed, because he'd noticed from the beginning. From the moment the first supervisor was approached, the first payment, the first quiet meeting in a parking garage that Mancetti thought was unwatched, Dominic had been watching. He'd let 6 weeks pass. Let Mancetti get comfortable. Let him think he was succeeding. And then, in 72 hours, Dominic exposed every bribed official, reversed every rerouted shipment, replaced every compromised supervisor, and delivered a dossier on the entire operation to 3 of the city's most influential power brokers. Not to law enforcement, not in a way that created legal trouble, but in a way that made absolutely certain that everyone who mattered knew what Mancetti had tried and how completely he had failed. The cruelty was not in the destruction. It was in the revelation that Dominic had allowed it to happen, that he had watched the whole thing quietly for 6 weeks and let it run just far enough to prove a point. You were never close. I knew from day one. I let you try because I wanted you to understand the distance between what you thought you were doing and what was actually happening. Mancetti had disappeared after that, left the city within a week. No farewell, no transition, no public explanation. He was simply gone. The city assumed he was finished. Embarrassed men with no power don't come back. They go somewhere quieter and rebuild what dignity they can from the pieces. Dominic never assumed that. He had known, with the specific certainty of a man who has spent years studying the architecture of human nature, that a man like Mancetti, proud, patient, and publicly humiliated, does not accept the lesson. He internalizes it as fuel. He goes underground and he waits. And when enough time has passed, when he's rebuilt enough and found enough backing and identified the right opening, he comes back. He comes back with something worse than what he tried the first time. So Dominic had built a perimeter around that inevitability. An early warning system made of human pieces. Petra, Haas, 3 other contacts in places Mancetti would eventually need to touch, and he maintained it patiently for 22 months. 22 months of waiting. And then, 18 months ago, the system registered its first signal. Mancetti had surfaced, not in this city, abroad, making contact with the Eastern families. The Terzi Group, the Brower Network, the Kale & Co. organization, 3 powerful entities that had been watching Dominic's dominance over the Eastern port routes with the quiet, calculating interest of men who see a large tree and wonder what it would take to fell it. Mancetti had approached them with a proposal. Back me, provide cover, and I will remove Dominic Cross from the board. The reward splits and route renegotiations that follow will benefit all parties. 2 of the 3 had given him a nod. Not money, not a formal commitment, but a signal, a nod that in this world is worth more than most contracts, that if the play succeeded, they would be at the table. Dominic knew about the nod within a week of it being given. He did nothing. He waited. Because the nod was not enough. He needed the attempt itself. He needed Mancetti to fully extend, to spend money, activate assets, bring in professionals, use Falcon, build the plan all the way to execution. He needed the Voss crew to be in position at Gate 7. He needed the gun to be fully cocked. Because what he was going to do was not just survive an assassination attempt. He was going to use it. He was going to use the attempt as a message, delivered live in real time, with the Eastern families watching, about what it looks like when you try to move against Dominic Cross. Not a story told after the fact, a demonstration. The ambush at Gate 7 was never Mansetti's weapon. It was always Dominic's stage. 22 months of patience. Every piece in place. And on Thursday night, Dominic Cross walked onto his own stage. And the curtain came down. Into the mouth of it. Thursday, 10:55 p.m. Dominic's car stopped at the outer fence of the South Shipyard. Rain coming sideways. Whined off the water carrying salt and diesel and the mechanical groan of the working port 2 miles north. He got out alone. He had sent Tio home 2 miles back. From here he walked. Through the broken outer gate, chain link pulled back at the base, rusted through, the kind of entry point that says nobody comes here anymore. Down the access road. Cracked asphalt split by weeds that had been growing through it for a decade, each crack a small monument to neglect. Past the dead cranes, massive, skeletal things, standing like the ruins of something that used to matter. Past the long black front of Warehouse C. Windows broken, roof partially collapsed on the eastern end. Darkness beyond the opening so complete it seemed solid. He walked through all of it without hurrying. And he felt them. Not saw, not heard, felt. The way the air in a room changes when someone is watching you from the dark. A specific quality of stillness, too still, the stillness of held breath in the spaces around the catwalk, in the ground-level doorways, in the elevated crane structure ahead. The pressure of attention, of crosshairs. 10 sets of eyes on him. He kept walking. His shoes moved through puddles without hesitation. His coat was soaked through across the shoulders. He looked straight ahead, at the single flood lamp that still worked, mounted 40 feet up on a rusted stanchion at Gate 7, casting its pale, yellowish circle on the wet concrete below. He walked into the circle. He stopped. He stood there in the light, in the rain, in the crosshairs, completely still. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a cigarette. He didn't smoke, not in 10 years, but he'd brought one for exactly this moment. He lit it. Let the flame of the lighter flare bright in the dark, a deliberate signal. Here I am, I'm not hiding. He took a long drag, let the smoke mix with the rain. He looked up at the crane control room. 40 feet above, dark glass, invisible to most eyes. Not to his. He knew the commander was up there. Knew he was looking down through the glass right now, watching a man stand alone in a floodlamp circle in the rain, smoking a cigarette. Wondering, maybe, why the target looked so relaxed, wondering if something was wrong. Something was wrong. Just not for Dominic. His phone buzzed once. He felt it in his left pocket. One vibration. He didn't take it out. He knew what it meant. Marco was in position. The 4 men were at both ground-level entry points. The specialist was on top of Warehouse C. Everyone was exactly where they were supposed to be. Dominic dropped the cigarette, let it sizzle out in the puddle at his feet. He looked up at the crane room. He raised his voice, just enough to carry through the rain. I know you're there. Silence. I know all of you are there. Eastern catwalk, ground level east and south, command position in the crane room. A pause. Good sightlines from up there. Whoever chose this location did their homework. Nothing moved, nothing answered. The rain was the only sound. I'm going to give you one chance to walk away, Dominic said, calm as a man ordering coffee. 10 seconds. After that, the offer expires. He counted. In his head, No drama, just numbers. At 4, someone on the catwalk shifted, shadow moving against shadow, a man adjusting his grip or his position, thinking the darkness was absolute. At 7, a radio crackled somewhere to Dominic's left, a short burst of static, someone checking in with someone else. At 9, Dominic put his hands in his coat pockets. At 10, he pressed his thumb against the small signal device in his left pocket. One press. The flood lamp went out. The entire yard plunged into absolute black. No moon, no ambient light from the working port reaching this far south. Nothing. A darkness so complete it had weight. 30 seconds. That was all they had. In those 30 seconds, Dominic moved. Not ran, moved. Left hand counting steps from memory. 15 feet, 45 degrees right, past the first painted line on the concrete behind the steel bollard. He pressed his back against the cold metal, size of a small vehicle, 8 inches of solid steel between him and the catwalk. He heard from behind him the sound of 4 men moving through darkness with the economy of professionals who had trained for exactly this. 2 toward the east door, 2 toward the loading bay. Silent, fast. He heard, from above and to the left, the faint metallic scrape of someone beginning to climb an internal shaft in the dark. Marco. At 28 seconds, Dominic counted down the last 2. At 30, the flood lamp came back on. The circle of light was empty. And for exactly 1 second, 1 single second, the Voss crew in their 10 positions looked down at an empty circle where a man had been standing, and felt the cold, specific horror of understanding that they had miscounted something. That second ended when someone on the catwalk fired. And then every gun in the yard went off at once. The darkness had lasted 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, the hunter had become the hunted. And the hunted had become something else entirely. 11 minutes. The sound of it was enormous. In the enclosed geography of the shipyard, cranes on 3 sides, warehouse walls, hard concrete amplifying every shot, the noise of automatic weapons wasn't a sound so much as a force. It hit the chest. It rattled the metal. It stripped the ability to think in anyone not prepared for it. The Voss crew was not prepared. Not for this. They were firing at an empty circle on the concrete. Their target had been standing there 10 seconds ago in the light, alone, with no cover visible, and now he was simply gone. No one had seen him move. No one had tracked him. He had pressed something in his pocket, and then the world went dark, and then he was gone, and the lights came back, and he was gone. Trained professionals or not, that particular experience in that particular moment does something to the operational brain. It introduces a variable that shouldn't exist. It suggests, in the span of a heartbeat, that something about the situation has been wrong from the beginning. That suggestion costs seconds, and seconds in a firefight are everything. From behind the steel bollard, Dominic heard the first burst of disorganized fire hit the empty concrete where he'd been standing. He heard the sparks of it, bright, sharp, like camera flashes in the dark. He pressed his back against the steel, kept his breathing controlled, counted. On the eastern catwalk, 2 Voss shooters leaned over the railing and swept their weapons across the yard looking for movement. They were scanning. Not disciplined scanning, reactive, anxious, the sweep of men who have lost their target and are compensating with volume. Dahlin came through the east access door low and fast. He'd been waiting in the service tunnel for 2 hours. He had, in those 2 hours, the same thought 17 times. Don't think about what could go wrong. Think about the 2 steps in front of you. The first ground-level Voss shooter never saw him. 1 shot. The second shooter spun, got off 2 rounds into the doorframe, both missed, before Reeves came through the loading bay south gate from the opposite angle. Crossfire. 4 seconds. Both ground-level shooters were down. On the catwalk, the 2 shooters scanning the yard caught the movement at the south gate. They swung their weapons. One opened fire. The rounds hit the concrete 20 feet wide of Reeves, who had already moved. The catwalk shooter hadn't accounted for movement. He'd aimed at where Reeves was. Reeves was somewhere else. From the top of Warehouse C, Carver had been still for 6 hours. 6 hours under a tarp in the rain, on a sloped metal roof 40 feet above the yard, watching the Voss crew move into position through a scope that cost more than most people's cars. He had cataloged each of their positions. He had noted their habits, the way one of the catwalk shooters kept his elbow out too far, the way the other had a tendency to lean forward when he fired. He had waited. When the first catwalk shooter leaned over the railing to scan the yard, that forward lean, right on schedule, Carver squeezed the trigger. One shot. The catwalk shooter went down. The second shooter pulled back hard against the catwalk wall. He pressed himself flat and looked wildly toward where the shot had come from, behind him, elevated, a position that had not been in the scouted perimeter, a position that wasn't supposed to exist. He reached for his radio. Before he could key it, Marco Vega opened the door to the crane control room from the inside. 6 minutes. That's how long it had taken Marco to climb the internal maintenance shaft in complete darkness, a shaft that hadn't been maintained in 8 years, slick with rust and standing water, not wide enough to climb without pressing against both sides, in the dark, in silence, while a firefight was happening 30 feet below him. 6 minutes. The commander, Willem Haars, Dutch, 15 years in the field, a professional who had run operations in 4 countries, was at the cracked glass window when he heard the door behind him open. He turned fast. Marco was already there. Not the gun. Marco. He was faster than the gun, inside the commander's reach before the hand completed its move toward the holster. One motion, the gun taken, the commander against the wall, Marco's forearm across his chest. No violence beyond what was necessary. Radio, Marco said. Haars stared at him. His face was doing the math. The math was coming up wrong. He handed over the radio. Below in the yard, the remaining Voss men, 2 positioned at the far south perimeter as a secondary line, who had been watching the main firefight in the confused, terrible way of men whose plan has completely collapsed, heard the radio go dead mid-transmission, and made the only rational decision left to them. They ran south toward the outer fence, the logical exit. Stead was waiting at the outer south fence. He had been there for 90 minutes, in position, in the rain, motionless. He'd been told they would probably come from that direction. They came from that direction. The last sound died. The yard went quiet. The rain kept coming, indifferent and steady, filling the new silence left by the absence of gunfire. The flood lamp still burned, its pale circle on the concrete, the wet concrete shining under it. Dominic Cross stood up from behind the bollard. He was not breathing hard. His face was wet from the rain but otherwise unchanged, the same expression he'd had when he walked through the gate. He straightened his coat. He walked to the center of the yard, back to the circle of light, back to the exact spot he'd been standing before the lights went out. He stood there, looked around at the shipyard, at the stillness. He looked up at the crane control room. Marco appeared at the door, 40 feet above, looking down. Even from that distance in that light, Dominic could read his lieutenant's face, controlled, professional, and behind that professionalism, something that looked like the expression of a man who will never fully get used to this. 11 minutes. That's how long it had taken. From the moment the lights went out to the moment the last of the Voss crew was on the ground. 11 minutes. Dominic put his hand in his pocket and took out his phone. He made a call. "It's done," he said. "All positions." The voice on the other end confirmed. "Good," Dominic said. "Bring him to the waterfront office. Give me 20 minutes." He ended the call. He looked up at the crane room one more time. "Marco," he called, his voice cut clean through the rain. "Bring him down." He walked toward the exit without looking back. Not because he was cold, not because he didn't care. Because there was nothing behind him that required his attention. The man who knows how a story ends doesn't need to watch the last page. The shipyard was finished, but the real conversation hadn't started yet. And the man Dominic really needed to talk to, the man behind all of it, wasn't in the shipyard at all. The weight of betrayal. The waterfront office, midnight. A long, low building at the edge of the legitimate dock operation. Thick walls, no windows on the ground floor. A back room that had been soundproofed 3 years ago. The kind of room where sound goes to die. Dominic was already there when they brought Willem Haars in. He was sitting at the table, glass of water in front of him still, always water, never anything else on a working night. The room was dim, one overhead fixture, 2 chairs. Haars came in with his hands bound and his face doing the specific arithmetic of a professional who has run the numbers and doesn't like the answer. 15 years in the field. He'd survived situations that should have ended him. He was not easily frightened. But he sat down across from Dominic Cross, and something in the quality of the man's stillness, the absolute granite stillness of a person who is not managing his composure, but simply does not have a composure problem, made the arithmetic worse. Dominic looked at him for a full 60 seconds. Not spoke, looked. Haars held it for 30. Then his eyes dropped. They always dropped. There was something about Dominic's gaze that made sustained eye contact feel like touching something at the wrong temperature. "I'm not going to ask you about the operation," Dominic said. His voice was conversational, almost pleasant. "I know everything about it. I've known about it for 3 days. I know the layout you chose, the positioning, the radio trigger. I know what Mancetti paid and when it cleared." He paused. "What I'm going to ask you is one question, and I want you to understand something before you answer. I already know the answer. I'm asking because I want to hear the correct version of it. Not the version you've been rehearsing." Haars was very still. "Who gave the final authorization to move on Thursday?" A long silence. "Mancetti," Haars said. Dominic nodded, as if this was the most expected thing in the world. "Was he going to be at the shipyard?" "No. Of course not. A beat. Do you have a contact method for him?" Haars looked at the table. He was running a different calculation now, not the arithmetic of what had gone wrong, but the arithmetic of what came next, of what the man across from him wanted and what he would give in exchange for it. "I have a relay protocol," he said. "Give it to me," Dominic said, "and I'll give you something in return." He let the next words come quietly. "Your life, your exit from this city, tonight. You drive until you're across a border and then you keep going and you never operate within 500 miles of this city again." Haars looked up. "And if I don't?" Dominic didn't answer. He simply waited, with the patience of a man who has all night and knows it. Haars gave him the protocol. Dominic called in one of Marco's men and gave quiet instructions. Haars was taken out. The door closed. 3 minutes later, it opened again. Enzo Falcone came in. He'd been picked up from his home 40 minutes ago in the middle of dinner. He'd been confused, then concerned. Now, walking into the back room at the waterfront office and seeing Dominic Cross sitting at the table in a rain-soaked coat with the expression of a man who has been waiting for this specific moment for a long time. Now he was afraid. He sat down. The guard who'd brought him closed the door from outside. Silence. Falcone looked at Dominic. His hands went to the table, then to his lap, then back to the table. He couldn't find anywhere comfortable to put them. "I want to explain," he started. "Don't," Dominic said. Falcone's mouth closed. The silence held the room, heavy, specific. The silence of a conversation that has already been completed internally and is only now being spoken aloud. "How long?" Dominic said. Falcone looked at the table. 8 months. The number fell into the room. 8 months. 240 days. In that time, how many meetings had Falcone sat across from Dominic and looked him in the eye? How many decisions had been made in which Falcone's information had shaped Dominic's judgment, information that was now, in retrospect, suspect? How many times had Falcone eaten at his table, accepted his protection, benefited from the organization he was working to destroy? Dominic did not let any of this show on his face. "Why?" he said, quiet, genuinely curious, not hurt, not angry, just asking. Falcone looked up. His eyes were wet. "Mancetti told me you were going to cut me out," he said, "that there was a restructuring, that I was going to be replaced in the Western District." His voice was tight. He had details, specific details, things that sounded true, Dominic said. Falcone stopped. "He made it sound true," Dominic said. "He gave you details that were close enough to real that you couldn't confirm or deny them. And he gave you a reason to believe you were already a victim before you'd done anything." A pause. "And once you believed that, once he'd made you feel like the betrayal was already happening to you, taking his money felt like self-defense." Falcone stared at him. "Was any of it true?" he asked, barely above a whisper. A moment. "No," Dominic said. Falcone closed his eyes. 1 second, 2, 3. The sound of the rain, the distant mechanical sound of the working docks, the sound of a man who has just fully understood the cost of a choice he can't undo. "Dominic." "Don't," Dominic said again, gently this time, almost kind. He stood, he walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. He did not look back. He had said what needed to be said and heard what needed to be heard, and the rest of it, the rest of Falcone's accounting, was not something Dominic needed to be present for. 20 years, Enzo, he said quietly to the door. "That's what you traded for 70,000 euros and a story someone told you." He walked out. He didn't stop. He didn't pause. He walked straight through the outer office, through the building's front door, out into the rain. And he let out a breath that was the only outward sign, in the entire night, of something being genuinely hard. Not the shipyard, not the killers, not the tactical complexity of the operation. This was the part that cost something. But only for a moment. Then the face closed again, the eyes cleared. He had one thing left to do. The most important thing. Mancetti. Falcone was handled. The Voss crew was finished. But the man who had designed all of this, the man who had been hiding for 3 years, rebuilding, waiting, watching, was still out there. And Dominic Cross knew exactly where he was. He had known since yesterday afternoon. He had said nothing. Because this last part, he needed to do alone. The storage unit on Volta Street. The Harbor District at 1 a.m. is not a place that invites attention. Narrow streets, low buildings, the smell of salt water and old industry, the kind of neighborhood that used to make things and now simply exists, warehouses converted to storage units, loading bays with rusted doors, the occasional light from a security booth at a gate. The complex on Volta Street looked like every other storage facility in the district, metal-clad, numbered, anonymous, designed to hold things without advertising what. Unit 41. The property was registered to a shell company in the Channel Islands, which traced, if you followed the chain patiently enough, through 4 jurisdictions, over several hours, to a holding entity in Malta that Silvio Mancetti had established 7 years ago. A structure he'd set up during a period of expansion and apparently never dissolved, perhaps because it predated his fall and he'd simply forgotten the loose end existed. Dominic had found it 18 months ago. He had told no one. He walked from the car to Unit 41 alone, left Tio at the curb with the engine running. This conversation was not for witnesses. The metal door, cold under his knuckles. He knocked 3 times. Firm, unhurried. Inside, silence first. Then the faint sound of movement, a television or radio cutting off mid-sentence. "Who is it?" The voice was 3 years older, rougher. The voice of a man who had been existing rather than living, eating without appetite, sleeping without rest, running on the specific diminishing fuel of obsession held too long. Dominic knew that voice. "You know who it is," he said. The longest silence of the night. Then the latch, then the door. Silvio Mancetti looked like a man who had been in a war that nobody else knew was happening. White at the temples, lines around the mouth that hadn't been there 3 years ago. Eyes that had developed the specific hollowness of someone who has spent too long scanning the horizon for threats. He looked at Dominic Cross, standing in his doorway in the rain. And his face did something complicated. Not fear, not exactly. Something more profound than fear. The expression of a man who has spent 3 years constructing an elaborate architecture of hope around a single outcome, and who is now, in this one moment, watching the last wall of that architecture come down. He had planned everything. He had been so careful. He had recruited Falcon, hired the Voss crew, coordinated the timing, used Mancetti's Cyprus account through 2 layers of intermediary. He had been patient. He had been precise. And Dominic Cross was standing at his door, in the rain, alone, looking like a man who had stopped somewhere on the way to somewhere else to tie his shoe. "You should come inside," Mancetti said, on instinct, the reflexive hospitality of a man whose mind had not yet caught up with reality. "No," Dominic said, "here is fine." Mancetti stood in the doorway. The light from the unit framed him. Behind him, Dominic could see the evidence of 3 years of exile, a cot, a card table, a laptop, a burner phone, 3 notebooks filled with handwriting that from a distance looked frantic. A man's entire reduced life, arranged in 200 square feet. "How long have you known?" Mancetti said. "The specifics, 3 days." Dominic looked at him steadily. "The general shape of it, 22 months. Mancetti absorbed this. It took a moment. 22 months, he said, slowly, testing the weight of it. "From the first contact with the Eastern families, I had 3 days from the moment you activated Falcon." A pause. "You were careful, but you had to touch certain things to build what you built, and I had people at every point you needed to touch." Mancetti looked at him for a long time. "The shipyard," he said. "Yes." "You walked in," he shook his head. 10 professionals, you walked in." "I needed them to fire first," Dominic said. "The difference between responding to an attack and preventing one in this city to the people watching is significant. You handed me a situation in which your people were the aggressors." He paused. "Thank you for that." Mancetti stared. Something moved across his face. Not quite admiration, not quite hatred. Something that lived between them. The expression of an adversary who has just fully understood the gap between what he thought he was building and what was actually built. "The Eastern families," he said. "We're watching," Dominic confirmed. "They received a message tonight that did not require words." Mancetti was quiet for a moment. "You used my operation," he said, "to send a message to the families I'd recruited to back me." "Yes." "You turned my play," he stopped. His jaw worked. "Into mine," Dominic said simply. "Yes." A long silence. The rain fell between them, and the city made its distant sounds, and the light from the unit illuminated Mancetti's face in a way that showed every year of the last 3, every sleepless night, every meal eaten alone over a notebook filled with a plan that had just, completely and finally, failed. "Why are you here?" Mancetti said. "If it's already done, the crew, Falcon, the message to the families, why are you here? Why not just—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Dominic reached into his coat pocket. He took out a phone, clean, unregistered, a single number stored in it. He held it out. "There's one number," he said. "You call it, a car comes, an airport, a flight that leaves before dawn, not in your name, in a name that will work. Lisbon." He met Mansetti's eyes. "There is an account there, enough to live on for the rest of your life modestly. You don't come back. You don't contact anyone who connects to this city. You don't exist in any way that touches anything here." Mansetti looked at the phone. "You're letting me go," he said. He said it like a man who doesn't believe what he's hearing. "I'm giving you a door," Dominic said. "You take it or you don't." "Why?" Mansetti's voice cracked slightly on the word. "After everything, why?" Dominic considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because dead men don't carry stories," he said, "and I need you to carry a story to every person you encounter in every city you pass through for the rest of your life." He held the phone steady. "The story of what happened when you tried to build a play against Dominic Cross, how it looked, how it ended, and how you left." He paused. "That story is worth more to me than anything else I could do with you." Mansetti looked at him. For a long time, his hand came up, trembling not from cold, from the specific exhaustion of a man who has been holding something enormous for 3 years and has just, finally, put it down. He took the phone. Dominic turned. He walked back toward the car, steady, unhurried. Behind him, he heard the door to Unit 41 open wider, heard Mansetti step back inside, heard the click of the phone waking up, heard the call begin. He kept walking. He did not look back. Some men need to watch until it's completely over. Dominic never did. He had already moved to the next thing. He was always already moving to the next thing. The last piece was placed. The board was clear. But there was still one final move, the move that would make everything permanent. The move that nobody in the Eastern families would forget. The table. 3 weeks later. A restaurant with no sign, no listing, no record of its existence in any directory. White tablecloths, candlelight, the kind of quiet that costs money to maintain, not the absence of sound, but the presence of a specific, controlled hush that tells you immediately that serious men use this room for serious conversations. 3 men arrived, one at a time, through the same unmarked side entrance. Each of them represented someone who hadn't come himself, because the men they represented were careful, and careful men send representatives to meetings where the outcome is uncertain. The Tercy Group, the Brower Network, the Kale & Co. organization. 3 families, 3 different cities of origin, 3 different ways of doing business, unified 3 weeks ago by a quiet agreement to extend conditional support to a plan that had since failed completely, publicly, and in a way that had generated exactly the kind of story that travels fast and far through the networks these men inhabited. They sat at the table and waited. The representative from Tercy was thin and watchful, with the eyes of a man who processes information quickly and reveals nothing. He had arrived first. The Brower representative was older, heavyset, the kind of person who used physical presence as a form of argument. He had arrived second. The Kale & Co. representative was young enough that his presence here said something specific about his organization, that Kale & Co. sent his youngest, most expendable face to a meeting he wasn't sure how to read. All 3 of them waited. For 6 minutes. Then the door opened. Dominic Cross walked in alone. No guard, no assistant, no one. He sat down. He looked at each of the 3 men, 1 look per person, 3 seconds each, the kind of look that takes a complete inventory. He said nothing. For 40 seconds he let the silence run. 40 seconds at a table like this with men like these is a geological age, long enough for every person in the room to feel the quality of the silence, who it belongs to, who is comfortable in it, who needs it to end. It belonged to Dominic. He was completely comfortable. The other three were not. The Terci representative cleared his throat. The events at the South Port, he said carefully. We understand there was a resolution. There was, Dominic said. The individual involved has left the area. Permanently, Dominic said. A pause. We want to be clear, the Brower representative said with the directness of a larger man, that our organization's involvement in recent activities was peripheral, exploratory. No formal commitment was. I know what it was, Dominic said. The room went very still. Not because he'd said it loudly. Because of the way he said it, the complete, flat certainty of a man who has access to a version of events that is more accurate and more complete than the version anyone else in the room possesses. I know what you agreed to, Dominic said. I know when you agreed to it. I know the channel through which the agreement was communicated and the individuals on both sides of that communication. He said it without heat, without accusation, as if he were describing the weather. I'm not telling you this to threaten you. I'm telling you so that we understand each other accurately. He let that settle. The young Kale & Co. representative had not spoken. He was very still. He was, Dominic suspected, smarter than the other two, or at least more adaptable, and had understood within 30 seconds of Dominic sitting down that this meeting had a predetermined shape, and that the only variable was how quickly they moved to accept it. I want the next 3 years to be productive, Dominic said. For everyone at this table, the current arrangements benefit all parties. The routes are stable, the yields are consistent, the political environment is managed in a way that protects everyone's operations. He paused. What happened 3 weeks ago was a disruption. The disruption is over. The individual who created it is gone. The professionals he hired are gone. The access points he used, a slight pause, are also resolved. A silence. What we do now, Dominic said, is return to the arrangements, with a shared understanding that attempts to alter those arrangements through third parties create outcomes that benefit no one. He looked at each of them one final time, and that such attempts will be known before they fully form, and responded to in a way that is, he tilted his head slightly, instructive. The Terci representative, the arrangements stand. The Brower man agreed. The young Kale & Co. representative looked at Dominic Cross for one moment, a long moment, the look of a man who is deciding whether to be afraid or whether to be something more useful than afraid, and then he said, "Yes." Dominic nodded. He stood. "Thank you for coming," he said. "The meal is taken care of." He buttoned his coat. He walked out. No farewell, no handshake, no theater. He simply left. 3 weeks, 3 families, and 1 night in a shipyard. And the message had been received by every person who needed to receive it, in the language that this world speaks most fluently. Results. The man at the window. He stood at the window of his penthouse. The city below was luminous and indifferent. 10,000 lit windows, the distant orange of street lamps, the moving lights of cars crossing the bridges, the cathedral dark and still against the sky, the river silver where the light hit it. He had a glass of whiskey in his hand, 2 fingers, the first real drink in 4 days. He sipped it. He thought about Mansetti, about where he was right now, somewhere over the Atlantic probably. A seat by a window watching the dark ocean below, a man erased, not killed, erased. And Dominic had learned a long time ago that the living exile carries the message further than the dead one. Mansetti would land in Lisbon. He would find the account. He would rebuild some quiet version of a life. And for the rest of that life, every time he sat across from someone new and they asked, in whatever careful, indirect way such questions are always asked, "What happened to you? Where did you come from? Why did you leave?" He would tell them. Not everything, but enough. And each person who heard it would carry a version of it forward. That was how messages traveled in this world, not through announcements or declarations, through the specific, permanent weight of stories told by men who had no choice but to tell them. Dominic thought about Falcon. 20 years. The image of him at that table in the back room, hands trembling, eyes wet, asking was any of it true, sat somewhere in Dominic's chest in a place that was not quite regret but was not nothing either. He had liked Falcon, had trusted him in the specific, guarded way that men in this world allowed themselves to trust, which was not full trust, which was never full trust but was real nonetheless. The thing about betrayal is that it always makes sense to the person doing it. In the moment, from their angle, with the information they have and the fear they feel, and the story someone has told them about how they're already a victim, betrayal always feels like survival. That didn't make it less of a betrayal. It just made it more human. And Dominic Cross, for all his stillness and precision, was not a man without understanding of what it meant to be human. He had simply decided, early in his life, that understanding it did not mean being controlled by it. He sipped the whiskey. He thought about the shipyard, standing in the crosshairs, the 10 counts, the darkness coming down, the 30 seconds, the bollard cold against his back and the sound of 10 guns going off in a shipyard at midnight and the specific, electric clarity of being exactly where you planned to be when everyone else in the dark thought they had you. He had not been afraid. Not because he was incapable of fear, he was entirely capable of it, but because he had done the one thing that fear cannot survive. He had understood the situation so completely, in such detail, with such accuracy, that there was nothing left for fear to grab onto. Fear feeds on uncertainty, on the unknown, on the gap between what you can see and what is actually happening. Dominic Cross did not have gaps. He closed them. He closed them with patience, with information, with the willingness to maintain, for 22 months, a preparedness that no one else knew existed for an event that hadn't happened yet. Most people don't have that willingness. It requires a specific kind of discipline, the discipline of not becoming comfortable, of not assuming that what hasn't happened yet won't happen, of maintaining the posture of vigilance even in periods of peace, because the periods of peace are exactly when the preparation happens. He finished the whiskey. He set the glass down. The city turned below him, indifferent and continuous, the same city it had been yesterday, the same city it would be tomorrow, running its 10,000 parallel lives without reference to what had happened in a South shipyard or a storage unit on Volta Street or a restaurant with no sign. That was fine. That was exactly right. He didn't need the city to know. He needed the right people to know. And they did. He went to his desk. He opened a file. Not because the work was never done. It was never done. That was the nature of it. But because already, in the quiet of this particular morning, 3 a.m. and the city still burning outside his window, he was thinking about something else. Not the Eastern families, not the aftermath, not the story that Mansetti was now carrying west over the Atlantic. Something further. Something that had not yet moved, that was in the early stages of forming, that most men would not have noticed yet. Dominic had noticed it 2 weeks ago. A pattern small, the kind of pattern that looks like coincidence until you see it 5 times. He was already thinking about the response. Not what to do when it arrived. What to do now so that when it arrived, the response was already in place. He was already 3 moves ahead. He was always 3 moves ahead. And in the pre-dawn quiet of his penthouse, while the city slept and the river moved and somewhere over the ocean, a man in exile told himself he had survived. Dominic Cross opened a file and began. What no one knew. Here is what no one knew. Not Marco, not Petra, not Haas or Hars or any of the 4 men who'd gone through the service tunnel or the specialist who'd cut the lights. Not the Eastern families and not Mansetti himself, the man who had spent 3 years building toward this night. The plan had not started 3 days before the shipyard. It had not started 22 months ago. It had started the day Mansetti left the city. 3 years ago, 2 days after Dominic had dismantled his operation in 72 hours, before Mansetti had fully crossed the border, before he'd taken his first exile breath. Dominic had known, with the precision of a man who has spent years studying how pride operates in people who have too much of it, exactly what Mansetti would do next. Not the specifics, the shape. He would disappear. He would rebuild. He would make contact with the parties who might benefit from removing Dominic. He would wait, and he would return. Not because Dominic could predict the future, because he had spent 16 years watching human nature with the attention of a scientist. And human nature, when it comes to pride and humiliation, is the most predictable thing in the world. So Dominic had done something that, to anyone watching, would have looked like standard operational maintenance. He had placed pieces, Petra, Haas, 2 other contacts in financial corridors Mansetti would eventually need to touch, a relationship with a property registry specialist who could trace shell company chains across 4 jurisdictions. He had maintained those pieces for 3 years, not knowing when they would be needed, knowing only that they would be. This is the thing that most men, even smart, dangerous men, do not understand about Dominic Cross. They believe his advantage is intelligence. They believe it is speed or information or the quality of his network. These things are real, but they are not the source of his dominance. The source is this: he thinks at a timescale that most men don't have the patience for, while other men think in days and weeks. What do I do about this situation in front of me right now? Dominic Cross thinks in years. In the long, curved geometry of consequences, where an action taken today shapes what is possible 3 years from now. He had not prepared for the shipyard. He had prepared for the entire sequence, of which the shipyard was only one moment. The Voss crew in the dark, the message to the Eastern families, Mansetti on a plane to Lisbon carrying the story, the table with the 3 representatives and the specific, permanent understanding that would come out of it. He had prepared for all of it 3 years ago, before any of it had started. And here is the final piece, the piece that even this account has been building toward, quietly, since the beginning. The night Mansetti had moved on Dominic's eastern docks 3 years ago, the night Dominic had begun watching and let 6 weeks pass before disassembling everything, was not the first time Dominic had been aware of Mansetti. Dominic had known, 18 months before Mansetti's move on the docks, that Mansetti was eventually going to try something. Not because of surveillance, because of a conversation, a single conversation at a private dinner at which Mansetti had said something, casually over wine to no one in particular, that Dominic had noted and filed away. The problem with this city is that one man holds too much. That kind of concentration always corrects itself eventually. He hadn't been looking at Dominic when he said it. He hadn't needed to. Dominic had heard the sentence, processed it in the way he processed everything, and concluded, he's telling me what he intends. Not directly, but the intention is there. He is the man who will attempt the correction. He had begun preparing that night. Not aggressively, not visibly, simply preparing, building the conditions that would make him ready for whatever Mansetti eventually became. Mansetti had moved on the docks 18 months later. Dominic had been ready. Mansetti had gone underground. Dominic had stayed ready. Mansetti had come back with the Voss crew and the Eastern families in Falcon. Dominic had already been in position. This is what power looks like from the inside. Not reaction. Not response. Permanent, patient, invisible readiness. Built years before it is needed. Used once perfectly, and then built again for whatever comes next. He didn't walk into a trap. There was no trap. There was only his design, and men who walked into it thinking it was theirs. What power actually is. Most people think power is something you take. They're wrong. Power is something you build in the dark over years while no one is watching. It is made of patience and information and the willingness to prepare for things that haven't happened yet. It does not announce itself. It does not need to. Most people think strength is noise, the loudest voice, the hardest fist, the most visible threat. They confuse volume with dominance. They confuse aggression with control. Real control is silent. Real control is the man who knew about the ambush before it was fully formed, who watched it develop, let it complete, and used it as an instrument of something larger than survival. Real control is standing in a circle of light, in the crosshairs of 10 guns and knowing, not hopping, knowing how it ends. Not because you're invincible. Because you built it that way. The most dangerous person in any room is never the loudest. It's the one who has already mapped every exit, who already knows every secret, who is already, in the quiet of their own mind, 3 moves past the move you're about to make, and who will say nothing about any of it until the moment the saying is no longer necessary. Because the man who has real power doesn't need to prove it. He just needs to use it. Once, correctly, and then return to the window and watch the city turn. He knew the mission was a setup. He refused retreat. Not because he was brave. Not because he was reckless. Because the setup was built for this. Because the enemy's trap was already his. Because Dominic Cross had never once in his life walked into a room he hadn't already mapped. And he wasn't about to start.